The divorce papers sat on the kitchen table, between them crisp and final, like a death certificate for everything they had built together. Emma's hand trembled as she signed her name for the last time as Mrs. Daniel Foster, and in that moment, as the pen lifted from the paper, she felt something inside her chest crack. Open, not her heart breaking, because that had already shattered 6 months ago, but something deeper. Something that felt like the very foundation of who she was crumbling into dust. Daniel sat across from her, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow, and neither of them said a word, because what was left to say when love had been reduced to legal documents and the cold efficiency of separation? If you believe in second chances, in the possibility that love can survive even our worst mistakes, please hit that like button, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and subscribe to this channel. Sometimes the most powerful love stories are the ones that had to break before they could truly heal. The mistake had been singular, devastating, and irreversible in its consequences. Daniel had missed the birth of their daughter, not because of traffic or a delayed flight or any of the reasonable emergencies. That might excuse such an absence, but because he had been at a business dinner, networking with potential investors for his startup, his phone on silent, his priorities catastrophically misaligned. Emma had labored for 14 hours, calling him again and again, leaving voicemails. That progressed from confused to frightened to desperate to something beyond anger, a kind of grief that comes when you realize the person you thought would move mountains for you cannot even hear you calling. Their daughter, Sophie, had come into the world with her mother's cries echoing through the delivery room, but her father's chair remained empty. And when Daniel finally arrived 3 hours later, stammering apologies and explanations about the future he was building for them, Emma had looked at him with eyes that no longer recognized him as her husband. The months that followed were a slow-motion collapse. Daniel tried everything: flowers, apologies, therapy sessions, where he sat with his head in his hands explaining how he had convinced himself that providing for his family meant sacrificing presence for security. But Emma could not unhear her own voice calling for him in that delivery room. She could not unfeel the loneliness of holding their newborn daughter and understanding with crushing clarity that she was essentially alone in this marriage. The divorce was not filed in anger, but in exhaustion, in the quiet acknowledgement that some betrayals, even unintentional ones, cut too deep to heal. Daniel moved into a small apartment across town, and they established a custody arrangement that felt more like a wound that refused to close than a path forward. 3 years passed like a slow exile from happiness. Daniel threw himself into being the father he should have been from the beginning, showing up for every scheduled visit with Sophie, never late, never distracted, his phone always off when she was in his arms. He built routines with her: Saturday morning pancakes, bedtime stories with different voices for every character, walks in the park where she would collect leaves and he would pretend they were treasure. But every time he dropped Sophie back at Emma's house, he would catch glimpses of the life he had lost: Emma's tired smile, the way she had cut her hair shorter, the absence of her wedding ring, the careful politeness between them that felt worse than any argument. He dated occasionally, half-hearted attempts at moving forward that always ended the same way, with him comparing every woman to Emma and finding them all wanting because they were not her, could never be her. Emma, for her part, had rebuilt herself from the ground up. She had returned to her career in graphic design with a fierceness that surprised her colleagues, throwing herself into projects with an intensity that kept the loneliness at bay during Sophie's weekends with Daniel. She had convinced herself that she was content, that she had made the right choice, that teaching Sophie about self-respect and boundaries meant showing her that even love has limits. But late at night, when the house was quiet and Sophie's room was empty, Emma would lie awake and remember the good years, the way Daniel used to make her laugh until her stomach hurt, the trips they had taken before responsibilities weighed them down, the way he used to look at her like she was the answer to every question he had ever asked. The reunion began not with romance but with crisis, as the most transformative moments in life often do. Sophie, now 4 years old, developed a high fever that spiked dangerously in the middle of the night during Emma's week. Emma rushed her to the emergency room, her hands shaking on the steering wheel, and without thinking, without planning, she called Daniel. He answered on the first ring, despite it being 2 in the morning, and she heard the terror in her own voice as she told him where they were. He arrived at the hospital still in his pajama pants and an inside-out sweatshirt, and when he burst, through those emergency room doors and saw Emma sitting there, alone, holding Sophie's favorite stuffed elephant. He did not ask questions or make it about their past. He simply sat down next to her and took her hand. Sophie was diagnosed with a severe ear infection that required monitoring overnight. And as they sat together in that sterile hospital room, watching their daughter sleep fitfully under thin blankets, the walls between them began to crack. They talked in whispers about everything, and nothing about Sophie's preschool teacher, about Emma's latest design project, about Daniel's startup that had finally found stable funding. And then, as dawn started to break through the hospital window, Daniel said something that changed everything. He told Emma that he had been in therapy for 2 years, not couples therapy or crisis counseling, but deep, painful work on understanding why he had made the choices he had made. He talked about growing up with a father who measured love in paychecks, promotions, about learning too late that presence was the only currency that mattered, about the night he missed Sophie's birth being the moment he lost himself and had spent every day since trying to find his way back. Emma listened, and for the first time in 3 years, she allowed herself to really see him, not the man who had failed her in her darkest hour, but the man who had spent every day since trying to become worthy of a second chance he might never receive. She saw the way he looked at Sophie with such fierce protectiveness, the way he had memorized every detail of their daughter's life, the way he still looked at Emma herself like she was the only woman who had ever mattered. And she realized something that made her chest ache with recognition. She had never stopped loving him. She had built walls around that love, had tried to starve it into submission, had convinced herself that loving him was a weakness she could not afford. But love does not die just because we wish it would, just because it has hurt us, just because moving on seemed safer than holding on. The rebuilding was not instant or easy. They started with coffee dates while Sophie was in preschool, awkward at first, feeling like strangers learning each other all over again. Daniel did not push or pressure or act like forgiveness was owed to him. He showed up consistently, proving through actions rather than words that he had fundamentally changed. He went to therapy sessions with Emma where they unpacked the layers of hurt and miscommunication that had led to that terrible night. He learned to be vulnerable in ways that terrified him, admitting his fears and insecurities instead of covering them with work and ambition. Emma learned to voice her needs clearly, to give him opportunities to meet her halfway, to accept that perfection was impossible, but effort and intention were everything. 6 months after that night in the hospital, Daniel took Emma to the park where they had gotten engaged 8 years earlier. Sophie ran ahead of them, chasing pigeons and laughing with the unself-conscious joy of childhood. And Daniel pulled Emma aside under the same oak tree where he had first asked her to be his wife. He told her that he could not promise perfection, could not promise he would never make mistakes, but he could promise that she would always come first, that their family would always be his priority, that he had learned the hardest lesson of his life and would spend the rest of it proving he had learned it well. If this story has touched your heart, if you believe in the power of second chances and the resilience of true love, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear this message today. Emma did not answer immediately. She looked at their daughter playing in the fading sunlight, at the man who had broken her heart and spent years trying to mend it, and she thought about what it meant to forgive, to truly forgive, not in a way that erased the past, but in a way that acknowledged it and chose to write a different future anyway. Drop a comment below and tell us, do you believe some mistakes can be forgiven? Share your thoughts with our community. 3 months later, they renewed their vows in a small ceremony with just Sophie and their closest friends. And when Daniel promised to be there in sickness and health, in presence, not just provision, Emma believed him not because the past had been erased, but because the present had proven him trustworthy. Their story was not about a fairy tale romance that never faced challenges, but about two imperfect people who loved each other enough to do the hard work of healing, who understood that sometimes love means breaking completely before you can rebuild something stronger than what came before. And when Emma looked at Daniel now, she did not see the man who had missed their daughter's birth. She saw the man who had shown up every single day since, the father who never missed a moment, the husband who had learned that the greatest success in life was not measured in business deals or bank accounts, but in being present for the people you loved when they needed you most, in choosing connection over ambition, in understanding that some mistakes cost you everything, but give you the chance to become everything you were always meant to be.